So welcome everyone to a conversation with Max Howell, longtime friend and mentor of mine, legendary open source creator. We're really fortunate to have his time today. Thank you to all of you tuning in for the recording. To jump in really quickly, I want to introduce our open source projects for those of you new to our orbit, so you can understand the angle that we're coming in. And if you're interested, we'd love to have you join our Slack community or jump into the GitHub, and I'll be posting those links in the chat. So our first open source project to share with you guys, certainly perhaps the most similar to Homebrew in many ways, is our project Devstream. Devstream is an open source package manager for DevOps tools. We've worked to make it as easy as possible for developers to put together more complete DevOps tool chains, manage and connect them all from a simple YAML file. If you're interested in these kinds of tools, we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. We are also the lead maintainer and creator of DevLake, a project we launched in December of last year that's grown very quickly over that period. Now part of the Apache ecosystem, part of the incubator program, and on its way to being an officially supported project of the Apache Foundation. DevLake, in our opinion, is certainly the most powerful dev data platform, allowing you to pull in all of the data from all of these different tools into one place so that you can query it, analyze it, and visualize it, giving you all these personalized dashboards to make sense of everything that's happening in your software delivery processes. So those are our projects. Definitely excited to get everybody's feedback and for you guys to join our community if you aren't already a part of it. Without further ado, let's dive into the topic at hand and why everyone has come here today. Our friend Max. For those of you who don't know Max, though I imagine all of you do, given all of the marketing we've been doing for this, Max is the creator. I'll say it for him because I don't know how comfortable he'd be saying this about himself, but he's the creator of perhaps one of the most successful developer tools of all time. Certainly one of the most ubiquitous developer tools of all time. Really a true open source legend, has been building great tools for so long, and has seen open source through a lot of its most recent era, which I think has been one filled with perhaps some of the most change. Max is also working on a really cool new project that I'm sure he'll share a little bit about with us. So Max, I'll pass the microphone to you briefly. Perhaps a quick introduction for anything I've missed here, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Max, and great to be here. In introduction, I started doing open source in 2003 or so, mainly because I just finished up a chemistry degree and done about a year in the lab in industry. And discovered that it was not what I expected. In fact, I was bored, and this put me into quite a depressed funk where I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And so I left, went back to my parents' house, and fell back into programming, which had always been this hobby, not something that I'd really considered for a career. I always thought I wanted to be a scientist or a designer. I did like, in the UK, we have what we call A-levels, which are like in between high school and college. And I did design A-level, had a scholarship for that. Probably should have gone into design, honestly, but I think it's fortunate that I didn't. So I fell back on programming as a hobby and started getting into open source that way, installed Linux, started hacking on a few apps for KDE, this desktop environment. For Linux, it still exists, I believe, although I haven't used Linux in a while, at least as a desktop anyway. Everyone uses it for DevOps, obviously. Worked on this music player called Amarok, and that's how I got into like making products and being into like the whole suite of what open source is. And I think open source is one of the more interesting ways to do programming, honestly, and which is why more people should do it in a non-commercial sense, even as well. Because you have to tackle every part of what it is to make a piece of software. from the programming is almost the least of it. And open source is like a crash course in that. Design and product, DevOps, and customer support. One of the parts which I think really helped with me making Homebrew into such a success was when I was working on Amarok, I would hang in the user channel, and every time anyone had any problem compiling it, building it, using it, or there was a crash, I would figure out how to make it so that wouldn't happen for anyone again. And I'd spend all this time on the build scripts. If you've ever built anything from source, and I think a lot of people nowadays probably never have, which is sad, but a state of how open source works nowadays. There's a configure script, and the configure script tries to figure out if you have all the other stuff you need in order to build this tool from source. And they're terrible. They're always terrible. They're still always terrible. And so I spent a lot of time just making it so the error messages would help the user. That was my attitude. It's like, okay, we're an open source project. We don't have any money. We don't have any staff. Everyone's doing this on their own time. So the user has to have the attitude, one, that they're going to fix it, but we have to help them as much as possible. We have to give them, we're the experts, but we haven't got the time to handhold them through it. So with Brew, like I spent a lot of time making it so the error messages and the error handling and how it worked there did the same thing. Anyway, I'm getting carried away with my introduction. I always do.
Yeah. No, it's a great introduction though, and I think really kind of captures your essence, at least in my understanding of you and our friendship. Being such a meticulous product person, it makes sense to me that was probably a big part of what attracted you to this, was just the capability to be able to fix the things that frustrated you, which I think is perhaps a rather common story for many of the best builders. So my first question in our kind of official lineup here, Max, is kind of going back to the beginning, right? When you started as an open source maintainer, I imagine the state of the art, as it were, in terms of great forums, maybe great publications, the kind of thought leadership type stuff. A lot of that was probably less mature, and many of the answers and the blueprints for this stuff were perhaps less clear and accessible. And I'm curious, what were the biggest challenges that you faced when you got started building open source technology? And especially with Homebrew, is there anything that you would have done differently in hindsight as far as navigating the open source kind of paradigm?
Yeah, good questions. Certainly was different. This was before Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow turned up in 2007. And I started programming when I was 6. My dad introduced it to me. He was a hobbyist computer guy, and like we had this BBC Micro, which was this computer that the UK had everywhere. And it booted to a basic programmer's prompt. So you could just try out programming. Like, it wasn't bash, it wasn't a shell script in the terminal, and it was only a terminal, but it was a programming language. So I got the hang of reading manuals, because what else could you do? Like, this was before the internet when I was learning. And like, well, I was 6. I didn't know how to, I'd like go to my dad and ask him questions and figure it out. So, you needed to know how to use manuals for sure. And everything that you bought would come with enormous sets of manuals. I remember when I got my first C++ compiler when I was 14 or 15 or so. My dad bought it for my birthday. Great birthday present it was. You might think it was terrible. I loved it. The manuals literally were about a meter of manuals. We had to like put up a new shelf to hold all the manuals it came with. Semantic, C++ version 6 something, I think. I don't know. But I think, honestly, because there wasn't internet, it put me off to a large extent. It's probably why I didn't think about doing it for a career, right? It's just like, it seemed so inaccessible, but the reward for writing a program was so great. Like, there was nothing like it. You'd write a little bit of code and it would do what you told it to really quickly as well. And the debug cycles were like super fast. Science and engineering of other kinds, like, I can't imagine being an architect. Like, those debug cycles are decades. Personally, it frustrates me when it takes too long. Like, right now for Tea, I'm building a bunch of stuff. And the builds, even now, like years since I did this for the first time with Homebrew, take ages. Like Dino here has been building for 40 minutes. Yeah. So the fast debug cycles was the addicting part, but the lack of material was seriously a problem. But the internet turned up, made it slightly easier. So we had like forums where people would ask questions, and then like, 50% of the time be a classic. They ask the question and then they reply to themselves saying they figured it out, but they wouldn't say how they figured it out. So you were like, there's an XKCD comic for it. It really represents that level of frustration. It happens so much less nowadays. Now that there's a forum for everything on Reddit and they're heavily populated, and we've got 2-3 billion people on the internet. Like that sort of thing happens a lot less. And of course, Stack Overflow is like a godsend. Like Stack Overflow changed development. Like when it first came out, you had to ask the questions. I don't think I've asked a question on Stack Overflow in like 2 years, because typically it's already there. And there's enough information there to help you. But yeah, it was definitely a different kettle of fish. You had to figure things out a lot more carefully, thoroughly yourself. And you had to endure frustration for much longer periods of time. And everything was C and C++. We didn't have nice languages at the time. Like obviously JavaScript existed, but there was no Node. There was no NPM. jQuery was something, and like, you could only use it in the browser, so nobody was taking it seriously as something that you would use for like making apps or utilities or programs for a computer in any other context, back-end stuff. This was before cloud computing in general, so that changed how you approach things. Well, that changed how I approached building Homebrew, because I didn't want to have to build cloud infrastructure. This was like a hobby project, right? A passion project that I was doing because I needed it, because the company I worked at the time needed a tool like that. So I didn't want to build a bunch of cloud infrastructure. So that was why I built it on top of Git. Well, there was multiple reasons I built it on top of Git. And GitHub was relatively new, so that there was this like neat way to build with Git. But I realized that, that would handle the downloads and updates for me. And I was like, great, job done, move on. Later, I realized that it also meant that you could hack on it really easily, which was one of the reasons Homebrew like took off so quickly. It's because I designed it like intentionally and unintentionally to be something that people could get into trivially. Like as a vital part of open source. Like people can't figure out how to be involved with your project. It's just not going to work. It won't work. Open source is like 90% about the community that evolves around those projects, whether or not they want to be involved in that project. Otherwise, you're just another software tool or framework or library or application. And developers get hundreds of those a week to look at. Why are they going to pick yours? You have to always be thinking about that for sure. So yeah, it was different. Like the tooling was certainly less mature. Like it's really amazing how fast as an industry we improve the state of the art for what we work on and how we work with it. That like every year we're like maybe doubling like the potential for productivity, providing you keep up with the tooling. That's the worst thing nowadays, right? It's the exhaustion of keeping up with everything.
Yeah.
And then like a lot of people like continuously feel like some form of imposter syndrome just because they don't feel they're keeping up the steady art. They don't. Hang on. There you are. You still here? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
I lost video for a sec. Yeah. They feel like if they're working in a dev shop or in a community of some kind, that everybody else knows the new cool stuff that's happening and they don't. But the truth is nobody knows. Maybe the only people who know are people like yourself who host these kinds of things and us talking on a regular basis with all these kinds of people. Forgot the last part of your question.
Oh, if there's anything that you would do differently in hindsight now that, and especially when you got the project started, I imagine there was lots of kind of challenges that you had to kind of figure out for yourself when it came to the question of, well, I've built this thing and now I want to release it in the wild, and now I want to invite other people to become a part of this. What was that like?
Yeah, well, that was an exciting few months. I started working on it in May. I think May 19th, 2009 was the first commit. you can go back in time and check it out. I conveniently wrote a rather cool README, so it's a good first commit. But like, I worked on it for months, and I was just using it myself. But while I worked on it, I had this feeling that I was onto something, that I had the right combination of features and developer experience. And, you know, the Mac was a relatively new platform for devs at the time. If you can believe it, like before that, everyone used Windows or Linux, and like anyone who was worth their salt used Linux. Nowadays, you know, I think you really can be more cross-platform, but Mac became the platform because it was Unix with a nice GUI and with a good setup. So it was the right time for a good package manager. Like there was a few people trying. There was MacPorts and Think, and forgive me, there was another one I can't remember. But they all had their issues. So while I was building it, I sort of got this feeling it was going to work. And like I always intended to open source it from the start like that. And that was partly because at the time there was like 10,000 open source packages in typical package manager. And like there was no way in hell that I was going to, you know, make all of those myself. Obviously, all package managers are open source, but I just didn't want to spend a lot of time on it. And of course, with hindsight, I spent tens of thousands of hours on it. But I wanted this to be something that I just made it work, and then other people would come along and supplement it. So from the start, I made it so that it was really easy to get involved in it. Read the README, explained how to get involved, and the project was intuitively designed in terms of file system layout, functionality, and how the code worked with itself, so that you could easily understand how the whole thing worked just by reading the README and like browsing a little bit of the code. And then I encourage contribution. It's built on Git, right? So you just clone it, you hack on it, and then you push, and then you've already made it so it can be used by you and other people. There was no like extra steps. There's so much open source. Even figuring out how to contribute is next to impossible. Like, unless you can be bothered to find the Discord or the IRC channel or the mailing list and I ask how to get involved. Like, that's the sort of thing you can't find on Stack Overflow still. That, you know, because, you know, Stack Overflow is for the 90% and the 5 to 10% who actually want to contribute to open source. You know, they typically just consider it their own job to figure it out. But yeah, if you're going to have a successful open source project, it has to be easy for people to get involved. I think a good example of an open source project that understood this recently is Bun. You hear about Bun?
I haven't actually. I'll have to.
Bun.sh. It's a new Node runtime, like it's a JavaScript runtime. Yeah. And it took the open source community by storm. I haven't seen as successful a launch of an open source project in years, honestly. Very impressively done. And it had all the key features required to make successful open source, in my opinion. Very easy to figure out how to contribute. README was very well written, although excessively long, but I get where the guy who did this is coming from. If you have 4 READMEs, people won't read the other 3. And they might not even find the information they need. In a way, it's better to have it all in one. But like, this is one of the longest READMEs I've ever seen, but very well written. This is what I'm saying with open source, right? You have to kind of be good at everything or find people that supplement what you're doing, because you're doing everything. You can't hire a bunch of people. You can't have a company of 100 people unless you're Facebook or Google or Microsoft. Which is part of the reason some of the more successful open source projects over the last 10 years have been made by corporations, and I have many opinions on that we can go into later. Great README, very easy to understand how to contribute. Not super easy to contribute, but at least you can understand how to. It's got a Docker file, right? You have to install it with a Visual Studio extension. He wrote himself. This guy is prolific, like incredible. And like, he's got tens of thousands of stars in a few weeks. Good going. And like, well, also like the other things an open source project needs to succeed. So either you have to be completely new and obvious that people need this thing, right? Or you have to be completely new, but over time people will understand that this is an essential piece of the infrastructure of the internet now. This is like, everyone's going to be using this thing for like whatever part of the siloed part of the software industry we're talking about, or preferably like across all of them, right? Which is what we're trying to do with Tea, but I'll talk about that later. So he made a competitor to Node. There's already Dino, which was the competitor to Node, right? Made by the Node guy. So surely it should be Dino. So how is it better? Well, it's super freaking fast. It's got loads of benchmarks that show that this thing is exceptionally quick. And right out the gate, it's fully compatible with the NPM dependency manager. So you can use everything out of Node, out of NPM straight away, and it works. And like it seemingly works really well, but not so well that people don't want to get involved. And this is kind of important too, right? If you release something that's too polished, then nobody gets involved because it works so well. They don't need to. You need those core individuals at the beginning of an open source project to need to get involved personally because something doesn't work for them, but they can see how they can fix it or they can get involved in some manner. And if you don't do that, then like it doesn't matter how great your project is, you're not going to get a community evolving around it. And then eventually it's going to die. It'll stagnate. You'll lose enthusiasm either because you've moved on or there's no community. Well, I've released 50 open source projects. Only a few of them have become ones that I've kept maintaining. And that's because either I moved on or a community didn't emerge. One of the ones I still maintain is called PromiseKit, was at its peak used by 100,000 iPhone apps. And I still maintain it because the community evolved. I don't use it. I don't do iPhone development anymore, but I still maintain the thing. And that led me to writing a GitHub action last year, which manages builds for iPhone and Mac Xcode projects. Even though I don't do any iPhone development anymore or any Mac development because I needed that for PromiseKit, and I'm maintaining PromiseKit because a community emerged. So you got to have it. Like I wrote this open source project in 2012, I think, called Bullscript, which was a transpiler for JavaScript. I was working on a web project at the time, and I didn't like JavaScript, and I didn't like CoffeeScript because it was way too much. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of CoffeeScript at this point, but there was a period in open source where everyone was writing transpilers for JavaScript. So you take JavaScript and you convert it in, you take something else and convert it to JavaScript. Because at the time, JavaScript was just shit. But what choice did you have? That was what the web used. And if you wanted to write something that was as good as like Gmail or Google Maps or like the other stuff that was coming out at the time, like Dropbox, then you needed to use JavaScript. But it was awful. This was before like people started trying to improve it. Still not great. I use JavaScript a lot now. I use TypeScript. I like TypeScript. Don't like JavaScript still. It's just, you know, like I was C++ like made me wary of like committing too much to a language before you vetted it, because in C++ you could shoot yourself in the foot like a million different ways. The language had too many features, and it still does. And I don't really understand why so many people still want to use it. Like we got Rust now. Use Rust. Why are you still using C++? Even the Linux kernel is accepting Rust patches now. Use Rust. Stop using C++. But like honestly, I think JavaScript made it easier to shoot yourself in the foot, and not in a major way, where you know your user would just be using a web page at the time, and it would just not work. Like nothing was happening, and like God knows why. It didn't help that different browsers had different implementations of JavaScript and everything like that. But you know, anyway, I'm off track again. Where were we?
No, I think you were definitely answering the question and going in a great pathway. And then it kind of nicely segues into the next part of the question, which is, you know, I think especially for someone like yourself who's thinking a great deal about, you know, user experience and the kind of quality of the features and the kind of effectiveness and efficiency of a product. What kind of advice do you have, and what lessons have you learned as far as kind of managing an open source project with that kind of product discipline? Because I think one of the challenges that many maintainers face, right, is you have to kind of walk this tricky line of, you know, figuring out what do you accept versus what do you reject, and how prescriptive should you be with, you know, what should be built next, or what features or capabilities might you prioritize. I'm curious kind of how you think about that balance of steering the product vision and steering all of that without necessarily being overly prescriptive and then kind of preventing that open source magic from happening.
Yeah. So it's very tempting with open source to accept every contribution that comes in. And like that's partly because, like I said, you need community. But if you accept everything that comes in, your product will very quickly become awful and nobody will want to use it. So you have to say no. You have to get good at saying no. I certainly, for a lot of the period that I was very actively working on Homebrew, I had a reputation that I was just a dick. And it's because I said no, basically. Like, people didn't like being told that their contribution wasn't going to be included. They'd done the work. Like, I feel bad, but like my priority was the project. I wanted to make sure that Homebrew, like, we had tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of users in the first year or so. And I wanted to make sure that they got what they expected out of the product. I felt personal responsibility. They'd chosen to use this thing I built. Like, I was grateful, and I wanted to make sure that they were the priority, not the individual contributors I was getting. So, you know, you got to say no, but like, do it nicely. You don't need a process. Like, companies have process, right? Open source has got to have less process than companies because you don't have the staff. And the process slows things down anyway. And like, you know, like, it would help if you had a bit of a project map. I never had one, but I can see how it would help. Being someone who tries to contribute to other projects here and there, if I don't know where you're headed, then I don't know if the thing I want to build is going to be something you actually want. So I do recommend, like, now GitHub has discussions. I forget how many years it's had them. It's a good place to open a discussion thread and say, hey, I'm interested in doing foo. Would you accept that? And if you don't get a response, the project's dead, move on. That's the truth. If you don't get a response in a reasonable amount of time, it's a big problem with open source in general. It's like dead projects. It's part of what we're hoping to fix with Tea, obviously. But yeah, like, open source isn't different to working in a dev shop or a company doing software dev. You still need to have some kind of project management in a way going on, and often that will fall on you. And then, you know, don't be afraid to tell people what to do. With Homebrew, I just started bossing people around, and I wasn't much of an experienced manager at that point. I worked at the company I was before a couple of years, and I became like lead for maybe a year and a half, lead of a small team, 3 or 4. So I didn't really consider myself a leader. But if it's your open source project, you got to lead it. Otherwise, it's probably not going to work out. I think all the most successful open source projects of all time have had an obvious leader. And it's human nature, I'm afraid, that you need someone at the top, someone who can make final decisions and has a big picture idea about where things are going. Like, this is how we are. Like, I don't think we can fight it until we have like AI overlords. I think it's just going to have to work this way. And so, you know, like, open source is a very small tolerance for fuck ups. It's the truth of it. Like, at a company, you have a marketing department that can gloss over fuck ups. Like, you're spending like $1 million a year or whatever to like pretend that you didn't do that thing, or justify it, or a PR firm that are like on your side and telling the rest of the world everything's fine, or distracting the consumer. Developers don't tolerate that kind of bullshit, and open source doesn't have marketing departments, so you don't have the room. You got to just be efficient and go for it.
Exactly. No, I think that's a really great answer, and I think gives everyone some practical ways to think about how to actually manage that balance. So my next question, which I think is kind of definitely related to this, Max, is you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, you know, I think you're arguably one of the most kind of prolific dev tool makers in history in many ways, and I think there is this whole subset of open source developers who are excited to equip the world with things to build better software. And I think dev tools are such a big part of the open source community. I think they bring with them some unique challenges that are probably quite different from that of building something that's maybe consumer facing, or is maybe kind of a front end widget that's going to sit on somebody's website. And I'm curious, as you kind of think about building dev tools, what are the things that come to mind for you as far as like what should you prioritize? Kind of what are the biggest challenges? Like how do you make a great dev tool? How do you make a great developer experience? And what are the things that kind of keep you up at night as you think about like, how do I make this thing work really well for somebody's workflow or to improve their, performance or productivity?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so if you're going to make like dev tools build the internet, right? Right back from when all of this started, and that for me is when Unix was created in like the late 60s, 70s. It's always been about create the dev tool, then build the thing. And ever since then, every time a new dev tool has come along, it usually was built on top of another one. And you got this like tower of like open source, essentially holding up the whole internet. Everything is built on it. The entire software industry, all digital infrastructure. And so the truth is, it has to be open source. Dev tools that aren't open source, unless you're Microsoft, they got away with closed source dev tools for a long time, but now they've realized the importance of open sourcing them. So it's got to be open source. There's no other way around it. If it's useful to you, open source it immediately. Put it on GitHub. Like for a start, like I'm trying to hire at the moment, right? And I go to so many people's GitHubs and they're bare. Like if you just open source a dev tool, even if it doesn't get any traction, but you built that thing, I'd hire you straight away. Like I wouldn't even bother with an interview half the time. I just go through your code, check it out, see how you handle the project, you're hired. Like for me, open source is the best gauntlet for being a developer. Like there's nothing else like it. But yeah, so making a successful open source project. Well, firstly, a good README. Like that, no one links to your project. Even if you got 1 million followers on Twitter, no one's gonna like go and link to your project after clicking the link to it. If the README doesn't give the information. So the first paragraph of the README really has to like sell the project. Why is this important? Who is it important to? And there's like, a few more things you should put in there, not coming to me right now, so I'll get back to them. And then the next paragraph has got to be, how are they going to start using this tool? Do not delve into other crap, because developers, they're sifting through hundreds of projects a week, like anyone, right? And or zero. If they're a zero person, that means that they're waiting for other people they know, developer influencers, to tell them what to check out. And those developer influencers are not going to tell these people who don't peruse anything to check out your project if the README sucks. And they're not going to tell them to check out the project if the README doesn't tell them how to use the project. I can't remember how many times, you can't even trust these mailing lists nowadays. Like one of the things I want to do with Tea, so Tea is Brew 2 for the people who don't know, right? It's a company I started about 7 or 8 months ago. We'll talk about it, I'm sure, at some point in the rest of this chat. Is a decent mailing list for software to try out based on the things that I know that I need in order to check out a project. And one of those things is how you get started with the project. I can't remember how much, so many times I subscribed to a few over the years, and they've linked to a project simply because it sounds cool. But then when you get to the second paragraph, how do you use this thing? It doesn't say. It doesn't say how to use it. It's ridiculous. How am I going to figure out how, if I, it sounds cool, I can put it on a list of stuff I'll try out next time I want to use something like that. But then I get to that and I can't even figure out how to use it. Like the amount of times it's like a library and it doesn't tell you how to import it. It tells you how to install it, npm i foo, whatever, but it doesn't tell you what the module name is. So you have to figure it out for yourself. No, it's ridiculous. No one's going to use your project. No one's going to try it. It's not going to get a star sent that goes like that. Have to know how to use it. And it has to be 1 or 2 lines. If you have 5 or 6 lines on how to use it, or heaven forbid, I have to use a Docker container or something like that, no, not going to do it, and no one else will either. Like, I consider myself like a good representation of what 90% of devs are going to do. That 10% of devs that are super enthusiastic and will jump through a million hoops if it satisfies their knowledge, make people think that everybody's like that, because they're often developer influencers, etc. Or, you know, they're people you know at work who are telling you about new stuff. And so when they come to doing their open source project, they think, oh, it doesn't matter how many hoops there is. All that matters is it's got a cool feature. And that cool feature is necessary as well, for sure. If you haven't got a cool feature, again, nobody's going to care. And most open source is incremental, let's face it. Most open source is built on the shoulders of giants. We used 9 things yesterday, and we realized that actually those 9 things needed that 10th thing, but they all work together, and they're all like related, or maybe they're directly competitors. Like Dino, the Node 2, essentially, not doing as well as it should. It's very good, but it's difficult to compete with a successful project. Node is like enormous. Dino is better, but is it better enough? Well, the next few years are going to show us, right? So you've got to have like something compelling that is a reason to use it. So what's Dino's compelling feature? Well, I really like the way it handles dependencies, where you can just import them using URLs. Why do I like that? Because I like trying out new stuff. And a lot of the time, new stuff is just like someone messing around. They might have posted like a gist on GitHub. I can import that gist with Dino and it will work. That's a magical feature. And that works on the browser and it works in the command line. Also, it builds things into single executables. It is a single executable itself. In fact, like, I'm building Tea with Dino because of that. Because Tea, being a package manager, needs like to basically have no dependencies. If your package manager has dependencies, how are people going to install the dependencies for your package manager? It's actually one of the problems that makes writing things like package managers like extra difficult, because you have, in order to bootstrap it, you have to like figure out how to install everything somehow else. You don't have the convenience of the tool you're writing in order to write the tool. So yeah, I picked Dino because like you can build, it is a single executable, so I can just curl that into my continuous deployment pipeline, and then I can build Tea into a single executable. So then it's portable. It's part of the reason I built Homebrew with Ruby, is because OS X, it's called OS X at the time, came with Ruby. So I knew that anyone who cloned Homebrew, it would just work. There wasn't any other messing around that anyone had to do. And you cloned it and it was straight into a source repository. Not doing that with Tea, because I wanted to use TypeScript, really like TypeScript. Like, I love Ruby, but you know, you shoot yourself in your foot with it. You know, like, tooling helps nowadays, but at the time, tooling sucked for everything. But nowadays you get completion for most languages in Visual Studio Code or whatever. But at the time, like, Ruby was like not supported by anything. Like, most things weren't. Or even PHP, you'd be struggling to get completion. Goes back to the previous question, right? It's like you had to have like a psychic sixth sense for how to write code, because you wouldn't know if it worked until you ran it. Like, there was nothing to help you. And of course, we were migrating away from type systems because C++ made everyone think type systems were awful. But that was, turns out, because C++ was awful, not because TypeScript systems were awful. Type systems are great. And we learned that because we spent 10, 15 years working with systems that weren't typed, like Ruby, and JavaScript, and Python, and all the other ones that became super successful because it was easy to get started with them. But then it was hard to write software that worked. I feel honestly like the next 10 to 15 years of software development is all about making engines and development systems and frameworks and libraries and tools that help make software more reliable. Everything sucks so much nowadays. Nothing works. You install a new piece of software, you know at the back of your mind it's not going to work. You're going to come to depend on it in some manner, and then it's going to crash, or it's going to spin forever, or something will just break and it'll have an error message that says, we're sorry, we don't know what happened, but we promise an engineer is looking into this. No engineer is ever looking into it, ever. Like, these things just don't work. And we tolerate it. Why do we as a society tolerate software that doesn't work. I don't get it, but I am determined. I'm on a mission to fix that, to make a world where software works, starting at the base. The base is the package manager. So Brew 2, heavy emphasis on building reliable tools based on what we're building with Tea. Starting from the base, moving up from there over the next 3 to 4 years. But yeah, like, will Dino succeed? No, like, I wonder, especially like Bun just came out, right? We were talking about that. So now everyone's like, well, I'm to Dino, we got Bun, and Bun's better. Bun's going to beat Node. Maybe it will, maybe. But Dino just like collected 25 mil of investment. So, they should what they need. What do they need? What's the killer feature? Because it's not faster than Node. It's certainly not faster than Bun. Developers care about speed a lot, especially with their dev tooling, right? Like, that's one thing you got to know if you're building dev tools, is that your end user cares about the thing they're building. They don't give two shits about what you built. They're very grateful for it. People are always coming up to me and saying, thanks for Homebrew. But do they care about Homebrew? No. They're very grateful it exists because they need it. What they care about is the app or the thing they're building. That's what they care about. That's what gets them up in the morning. So when Homebrew breaks, people are angry. And like, I'm angry with them. Shouldn't break. Like, I don't work on Homebrew anymore. I haven't since about 2016. I did tens of thousands of hours on that project. I felt it was good. I wanted to move on. And the community that had emerged was fabulous. Like, some really, really great people had turned up to help with Homebrew. And so I just handed it over, and it's done great since. So nowadays, I'm just a user. So when Homebrew breaks, I'm pissed off. I was pissed off when I worked on it full time. But yeah, like, Homebrew is like a thing you need to get on with the stuff you care about. And you need to know that as someone who's writing a dev tool. Do not write your README in a way where it's like, hey, look how clever I am. And you're like talking about how clever this little feature of it is that people don't care about. People care about if it does the thing they're looking for. You got to understand that. And so like, I've met a lot of people who've done that dev tools, and I don't really get why like nobody sings my praises, essentially. Like, it's just so clever, this thing I wrote. And I don't get why people don't use it. It's because like nobody cares if it's clever. They care if it's useful. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think that's an easy to implement takeaway for anyone listening. Is that focus on, don't obsess over what it is that you're building. Focus on how you're enabling the people building something with your thing. And I think if you're thinking about that kind of outcome, you're naturally going to land on the right emphasis. And it's already given me thoughts on how we can, improve the way we're going about that for ourselves. And you touched upon, my next question, Max, which is awesome, which is, kind of thinking about what the kind of future of open source contribution might look like, and kind of thinking about it today and maybe in the recent past, like what you consider to be the kind of biggest impediments to progress today. And I'm curious, as like a question to layer on top of that, about kind of what the future and what the kind of biggest impediments are. If you're kind of seeing any general business models or approaches to this that are either like super frustrating to you, they're pissing you off, or maybe some business models that you think are, perhaps more compelling. And I think that probably rolls into kind of what it is you're working on today quite nicely.
Yeah, that's to a certain extent. So like, open source has changed a lot. Like, if we consider the beginning of open source, when the Unix lads built Unix back at MIT, and during the 90s, Linux turned up. Like, GNU was obviously there before that, but Linux was important. And like, I don't know, there's a good story there about the sort of things I'm talking about, how to make successful open source. Like Richard Stallman and GNU, they were very, very focused on the freedom aspect of open source and not the product. And Linus Torvalds came along and was like, Well, GNU's good, but like the kernel sucks, and that's kind of important because it is. Nobody could use GNU before that, right? Like the Linux kernel is what Linux built, and because before that the GNU guys were trying to build their own version of Unix. GNU's not Unix, that's what it stands for. Very old programmery joke where it's a recursive acronym, and you had to find your own kernel. So you had to get like one from one of the commercial versions of Unix. So you either stole it, or you pirated it, or you paid for it. And so you didn't have a free operating system. You just had most of a free operating system, but not the most vital part. Why was that? I don't remember. But Linus turned up and he was like, okay, I'm going to try. And he had a very humble email to one of the mailing lists saying that, it probably won't be big or proper, but I'm getting started on like my own kernel for GNU. And then that is the software nowadays that powers most of the world. It's good open source stories, but it was different then, right? There was mailing lists and IRC, and there wasn't GitHub, and there wasn't really even SourceForge, which was the precursor to GitHub, where you could centralize code and work on it with people, which is kind of essential. You need like somewhere to go anyway, so people can collaborate. And GitHub was so much better than SourceForge. Like, good job, GitHub guys. The ones I've met, I've always told them that they did a good job, and they're still mostly doing a good job. So, it's changed. And like during the 2000s, or probably post iPhone, so we're talking like 2009 onwards, when development exploded, thanks to the iPhone, like it really did change. Like before 2009, before the iPhone, being a programmer was distinctly uncool. You go to parties, and if people ask you what you did, you just sort of like mumble and try not to mention it, because if you told them you were a developer, they would be uninterested and walk away. Nowadays, you're cool. You're making apps. Oh my God, you're making apps. I have an idea for an app, etc. I don't know. Like that hasn't happened so much for a while, but for a long time, it was an explosion in interest. And also during that period, I think open source migrated to often being paid for by big companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon to a certain extent. And that changed the nature of open source away from what made it so important in the first place, where it was people making the things they needed, giving them to the world, and then trying to maintain those things because they didn't get any money. And like we need money in this world. So that's why companies started adopting these developers, bringing them on board and saying, hey, we use this open source, so we're going to pay you a full-time salary, work on that open source. Who could refuse that? No one ever offered that for me with Homebrew. If it had happened, things might have been different. That did happen to who is still the lead maintainer now, Mike Quaid. GitHub hired him to basically just work on Homebrew. But I think over the last, since that started happening, it is migrated to something I don't really approve of, and I don't think is good for the internet, and it's not good for open source, where these companies have too much control over the entire open source ecosystem now. They have an agenda, like even if they say they don't, everyone has an agenda. There's always an agenda, right? And the agenda of open source should be driven by the community, because that is what is best for the internet and for the software ecosystem and for everything we love and come to depend on. And that's how open source started, and that's how open source became successful. I don't approve of it. I don't think Google should have so much power. And there was something the other day about Kubernetes, where like the developers that work on that at Google are moving on to other projects because there's no career trajectory for them working on Kubernetes. So you have like some important open source that's going to like basically disappear because of the way things work at companies. It needs to be removed, and that's part of the thing we're doing with Tea, right? Tea is it's Brew 2. I say that, but I consider that Brew is going to be a very complementary project to Tea. I'm not trying to replace Brew. Tea is far more developer-centric. Brew originally was, right? But it changed over time because I moved with what the users wanted. And Brew has got an enormous user base, and it's not just developers, it's people who need that kind of software. It's all over the spectrum. I've had emails from musicians and architects and scientists over the years. Still get them, unfortunately. Like, people don't realize I don't work on Homebrew anymore. I do not work on Homebrew anymore. I have to forward them to someone else a lot of the time. So Tea's a lot more developer centric. So it's going to be a really kick-ass like tool, a developer tool. The package management part of it is part of it. I've really come at it from a new base this time, where I'm like, okay, so package manager like has a lot of power because you control the entire development stack, all of it. You have access to all of that. So what can you do when you have that kind of power? So I built a tool which is essentially a set of primitives for packaging. And so packaging becomes more programmable, more composable, and something that people can use to build new tools, entirely new kinds of tooling, as well as using it for just general development. Like I've come at it also with a very team-centric philosophy. Like when I built Homebrew, it was an open source tool. And like if you could use it with your team, then great. Like people weren't building team tooling as much. So this time around, it's very team-centric. Everyone works in teams. Doesn't matter if you're working at a company or on an open source project. It's a team. You're working together. Like everything's about collaboration. Maybe it's because like GitHub didn't really exist that well, like stuff like that. You know, really changed the nature of open source. GitHub, like they've probably done the most good for it out of anyone. So you know, it's going to be a kick-ass product. With some other stuff I'm not going to talk about. But like a key part of what we're doing as well is this idea that people who work on open source need to be funded. Well, obviously, this is a problem as old as open source, where, you know, I remember the meme I sort of slashed out once, like, originally. It's like a picture of a guy that's down on his luck with a sign, and it says, open source developer will work for food. Like, you know, it's the nature of open source is that no one's really paid for it. And like, we've been trying the sponsorship and there's bounties and things like that. You know, you can do GitHub sponsorship and you talk to anyone who's a developer and they're guilty that they don't really pay for the open source they use. But sponsorship doesn't work well enough for everything, I mean. Like Log4j is a great example from December where, you know, like there was an exploit and like it turned out that a lot of the internet used Log4j. And there was this 0-day root exploit that a lot of things were susceptible to. Like with Minecraft, you could type a string into the chat and then own the server. No one had ever heard of Log4j, like, bless them, you know. It's one of these dependencies that's deep in the stack and it's become entrenched. Like earlier I was talking about how the blocks formed on top of each other over the last 25, 30 years. A lot of the time when those blocks formed, stuff was built on top of it and then people forgot about the stuff that's buried down there, but still maintained because people like me who build open source that's necessary. My promise kit, it's got so many users. I feel compelled to keep working on that thing. We're those kinds of people. So, you know, for me, it's like, what else would I have built if I could have worked on open source full time for my entire career? Been working in software like 16 years professionally. And in that time, I've probably put 20% of my daytime hours into open source when I could afford to quit a job or I left for other reasons. And then I work on open source. I always worked on open source. I always work on open source. I'm always building open source stuff. It's just my nature. And so for like the first 10 years of my career, like I would work on open source at work. I wouldn't tell my employer, sorry, everyone who I work for. And I'd do it in the evenings and work during the night. You know, I was in my 20s and I figured out I could work 18 hours solid as long as I slept 12. So I would get up on Saturday, work 18 hours straight and then sleep 12 and then go back to my job on Monday. So what would I have built if I could have worked on open source full time? And like, this is the case for everyone who's ever built open source and all these important projects that have stagnated into maintenance mode or, you know, turned into something which like exists but doesn't improve any. Like corporate sponsorship of like actually hiring people has helped. But sponsorship itself as an idea really only rewards the top of the stack is what I'm saying. There's all this stuff underneath it that when it breaks, the internet has a panic. And especially nowadays, as security is becoming ever more a thing. Like Log4j is an example, right? They maintained it, but they didn't have the time, energy, or incentive to do a thorough security audit on that stuff. So I came at Tea with the idea that package managers is like at the root of the stack. We have the power in a way to figure out how to remunerate the open source ecosystem. We know where all the dependencies are. We know the entire stack. Like companies like Microsoft donate lots of money to open source, but they don't know all their dependencies. It's really difficult to figure that out. And even if they did, they have no idea how to give them money. In order to give them money, you need some system of automation that makes it possible for you to go, okay, look, I'm going to put $1,000 in, just give it to all the projects I use. This company, Microsoft, uses open source. We consider it to have value to us of like $5 million a year. It's done $5 million into the open source ecosystem we use. And then the tool figures out where to send it. So with Tea, we got this idea that, you put some money in on like the dependencies that you know about, and then we filter it through to everything that those things depend on, all the way down the stack, provided the people who maintain these things have registered the fact that they use it. You can only really do it if you make a package manager. Like from a product standpoint, if I just made like this system for injecting value into open source, everyone would go, wow, that's great. And nobody would use it. Just like I was saying earlier, right? You've got to give them a use. You've got to have usage. So what's the usage? Kick-ass package manager, bundle on that, usage over the next 3 to 4 years, and then the money will start flowing through to developers.
Yeah, I love that. And I think what's so exciting probably to everybody about this is, I think about the tweet that you've got pinned on your profile, which is definitely very funny, about some critical piece of infrastructure that's maintained by some random guy that's never received a cent or a single thank you in Kansas, and I think that really kind of captures the essence of this space in some ways, right? Or the essence of the challenge with the space. But it's so exciting to envision, if this much software is fundamentally dependent on open source tech, what does a future look like where you've incentivized all of that? Because we're already this far where arguably they aren't incentivized in any meaningful way beyond altruism.
Like, I think like 90% of decent open source projects just disappear because the person who made them cannot afford to work on it. And it was good at the time, and while they needed it, they worked on it. How much further ahead would we be in the internet and in software development in general if all these really smart people could have kept working on those important pieces of infrastructure? Like what I want with Tea is to make it so that it is possible for people who work at Facebook and Google, who are super smart engineers, to quit and work on open source full time. As far as I'm concerned, their intelligence and ability should be used for the benefit of all humanity and not for optimizing algorithms that encourage clickbait and to make ads more effective. That is just such an appalling waste of human talent and ability. It's disgusting, frankly. I don't blame Facebook and Google. Like, they got the money to pay for those engineers, and so they do. And that's how companies work. Companies are amoral as far as we're concerned. Like, they don't always do good and they don't always do bad, but they're going to continue to exist. So we need to compete. And like, that's what I want Tea to do. We're going to make it. We've released a white paper on Howell. We're going to do most of it. We're going to doing a yellow paper now on like the details. And we think we've got a really very clever system to put money into open source without changing how open source works. Like, most people, when I tell about Tea, they assume that it's going to be like Tea install node or whatever, and then it's going to like take a micro payment out of their wallet or something. So it's going to cost you like 0.1 cent to install node. And like, yeah, that would be great if it worked, but it wouldn't work. You can't change the nature of open source. No one's going to use Tea if it changes a fundamental property of open source, in that usage is free. So we have a fairly clever indirect payments model, and you should go and read our white paper. So I think it's going to work.
Yeah, it's definitely very exciting, and I think you touch upon a critical piece of a really great product advice too, which is, augmenting the existing behavior without trying to fundamentally change it. And I think I've certainly seen in my life as someone sitting at the intersection of product and tech and marketing that seems to be where many things go wrong, right? Is even if it is great, you're just trying to change too much of the equation, and people are resistant to that.
Yeah, like especially devs with their 100 projects a week to check out, they want it basically to be like the elevator pitch is YouTube, but for cats, you know. So they want to know it's like Node, but something about it is really great, and they need that really great thing. And then they know that the base tool is basically Node. So they understand Node. They've used Node. They get how it works. So that gives them an opportunity to try it out. And that, like, if they don't try it out, then you're screwed. You need like 10,000 people to try a project. And hopefully a lot of those will be influencer types. Now, they're not just influencers on TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or whatever. These people are like the person at the office who everyone listens to when they're considering what new tools to use. That expert, or just someone like at the dev event who like sings the praises of foo. You need that. Like Homebrew had that, basically. I can pinpoint the moment in 2009 when Josh Peak started talking about Homebrew, and at the time he worked at 37 Signals. They made Ruby on Rails, and so he was a developer influencer. And he said, when I install new version of OS X that's coming out soon, I'm going to use Homebrew as my package manager. After that, that's when it exploded. You need that moment. You need to, like, it's like the random person, the critic that visits your restaurant, right? You don't know when they're going to visit. So you always have to be on form. So when they visit, they write that review that makes you a massive success. With open source, you got to be like perfect before you're successful, so that when that person that will make the difference tries the thing out, they have a great experience and they sing its praises. That's why I say like open source is really interesting to work in, because you have to do everything, but also it's like some of the hardest stuff to work on and like the lowest paid. It's so difficult to make a successful open source project, but if you do it, you should pat yourself on the back, because you did something that very few people can do. And then you got to like pat yourself on the back extra hard, because you're not going to get paid. Very unlikely, at least. You got to be a top tier project to make enough money off sponsorship, basically. So if I'd stuck with Homebrew, I probably would be able to like earn a sponsorship salary at this point. I'm glad that I didn't. I feel that part of my duty to the world, honestly, is to continue to make the things that I make, because sometimes they are important. So, you know, I couldn't have stuck with it forever.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very fair self-assessment. Certainly agree with it. So my final question, Max, and I'm so grateful for you going over our time here. It's been awesome. You know, I think we've talked a lot about the kind of maintainer and creator side of the equation, but of course a huge part of it is the contribution side of things. And I know you mentioned that you occasionally make contributions to other projects. I'm curious, you know, for a developer who's perhaps kind of looking to contribute for the first time and they're starting to explore this, what would be your kind of advice on how do you make the best impact, and how do you really kind of get involved in making contributions that really matter in the end?
Yeah, well, like any project that you want to contribute to, if they're not extremely welcoming, then it's not a project worth being a part of. You know, for several reasons. Like, obviously, it's not going to be satisfying to you if you feel that you're having to get blood out of a stone in order to like get appreciated or have your stuff merged. But also, the project's going to fail. Any project that's not welcoming to community is going to fail. But like getting started, well, start with a bug fix, and then that will get you into the code base, and then learn the code base. And if you keep turning up, then you're going to become a core contributor in 3 to 4 months. 3 to 4 months, whoever is currently core will have recognized your contributions and will be, if it's a good community, encouraging you to participate more. And the truth is, like, being participatory in open source is extremely rewarding. The most rewarding work I ever did was Homebrew, for sure. Like, there were so many people that were excited about it and were into it, and you know, just getting value out of it beats any commercial product I've ever worked on. I've worked for some interesting startups. There's nothing like it. So even if it doesn't pay forever, you'll still get enormous value out of it if you can get yourself in there. In terms of starting your own projects, I would start by being part of someone else's. That's how I started, right? I found Amarok, the music player, because like the guy was appealing for people to join. Like I joined because he appealed for people to join, and it was the kind of project I wanted to be part of. And that was a roller coaster of learning how to be part of open source that way. So don't start with your own; it's a lot harder. But you should probably like be working on your own all the same. Just don't expect them to like get any traction until you understand how to do that, how to get that enthusiasm. And if you're working on your own stuff, what should it be? Well, don't come at it from the perspective you've identified a niche, so I'll build it. You have to need it. You have to dog food your open source because you're not getting paid, at least currently, until Tea exists. And you know, you've got to be passionate, and you're going to lose that passion if it's not something you need. If you're just building it because you know it will work, it won't work. Probably, like everyone's different, obviously. But in my perspective, it's got to be dog-fooded. And I start small. Like every big project started small. I love the manifesto, not the manifesto. There's a quote from the guy who did PHP. Something like, I never intended to write a programming language. I just kept building on top of what I had, and then PHP came out. And PHP is like one of the biggest ever projects, isn't it? Like it still powers a huge amount of the internet. It shouldn't, but it does. And why does it? Like PHP is a good example of like, people don't always pick what makes sense in a rational sense, right? PHP always got security problems, always crashing, always going wrong, always something is, you know, like I've done a fair amount of PHP a long time ago, so I'm sure it's a lot better than then. But it was so easy to like write something that looked like it would work, and then it worked most of the time. And then like sometimes it would just like delete the whole database. It was incredible. And so why is PHP so successful? It's just because it really got what people needed. They needed a version of Perl, essentially, that wasn't a headache. And like PHP's design is quite lovely. Like you can do so much with one function call in that language, and half the time that function call is exactly what you needed. And like you're like, okay, great. And then they, from the get-go, this is, you know, before it was common to have good documentation. And that's a very important part of open source that we kind of glossed over. They had great documentation. Every function was well documented, and if it wasn't well documented, at the bottom there was comments. And you know, part of the reason they had comments on their documentation is because they built their website with PHP, and PHP was so good for getting things going quickly. And that's half the thing with dev tools, right? Quickly, otherwise they're going to move on to another tool, and this is other very compelling reasons. But quick for a developer is worth a lot more than other things, a lot more. And then they need to be able to do it thoroughly and proper. And well, unfortunately, as I've said, everything sucks nowadays. Doing things properly is hard with the current set of tooling. So, you know, Tea, definitely coming at it from the perspective of like, let's fix doing things properly without spoiling being able to do things quickly and to do things in a way that's fun.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah, and I think, you know, that's certainly a consistent theme in a lot of what you've said there. You know, I think it boils down to like speed, you know, stability and responsiveness. And, you know, if you're nailing those things and you're focused on, you know, how are you enabling, you know, the people using your product to go and do the things they're already doing, you know, better, faster, more easily, you know, create higher output, create better results. Like you're focused on those things, you're likely going to succeed. And if you're not, perhaps you're not going to. So it's super actionable.
Yeah, like you know, that's the scary thing about open source is that, yeah, as I said, like there's very small margins for error, but it makes you a better developer very fast. There's nothing like it. It really isn't. I do encourage people to get involved, but truth is, as long as 5 to 10% developers do some open source, we're probably all right. Let's see if we can encourage that number up to 20%, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we're excited to be following it. We're excited to be supporting it, and seeing if we can even get involved. Well, anyway, Max, I know we're well over time, and I'm so grateful for you being so generous with your time and your experiences here. And on behalf of all of us at our team, and everyone watching live and everyone watching the recording afterwards, thank you so much from all of us. As far as kind of giving you a quick opportunity to kind of share anything, is there anywhere where you would like people to either follow you or connect with you or follow your work? Or
yes, so go to Tea.xyz. That's our web domain. Very pleased to be able to get TEA dot something, and it rhymes, so that's nice. Authenticate with GitHub. We're not doing anything with your data. We're just going to use that to see how you've contributed to open source, and there will be a reward associated with that once T goes live, which will be later this year. Also, I'm hiring. I really need devs who are passionate about open source, package management, developer tooling, and a few people who are good on front end, like React is certainly what we're going to use. We have lots of open positions, and we're well funded.
Incredible. Fantastic stuff. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Definitely join us on Slack. The links are just there in the chat. I posted the link to Max's website there. You should definitely check it out if you haven't already. Follow him on Twitter. And then keep an eye on us. We're going to be announcing our next guest speaker soon. But I think that calls it a day here. We're well over time, and thank you so much, Max. Always an honor to have your time. And I'll look forward to our next chat and to see what we can do together to keep making open source better here.
Damn right. Thanks very much. And yeah, speak to you soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.